So for those of you who are on, and I know others will join as we move along, this is the first leadership masterclass. And the objective of the leadership masterclass, as I was saying earlier on, is really to give you a context of the environment you're working in. Now, if you take the value add module, we talk a lot about, hi Mashatsi, no problem. We talk a lot about, you know, you personally in terms of the self-mastery skills, etc. And then some of you have attended the mogul classes. In the mogul classes, we tend to be very specific about a subject matter and a topic, right? So in, you know, for example, we talked about, you know, personal branding and social media. The leadership model is supposed to give you a broader view of what's happening in your world, and particularly in this context in the South African world, and particularly in this context in the financial services sector. So I couldn't have thought of anybody more amazing than my wife to come on board and talk about this. She fulfills all the criteria. She's a senior executive. She's in the financial services sector. And on top of that, I've been wanting to do this for ages. So this was a great excuse, because this is the first of many interviews. As you will hear my wife talk, you will hear that she's quite deep in knowledge and experience. So I need to use her for value add in a variety of other areas, but I've started here. So for those of you who've come in, thank you for coming in and joining. And what we're going to do is my wife's just going to run through a presentation, right? Which I will come in and out of every once in a while. And then we're going to leave the last 10, 15 minutes, or probably longer, 20 minutes for a conversation. And remembering that, and I know this is your first experience of this is a macro view of a segment called the financial services sector. And it's important for you to know it, because of all sectors that affect the economy of this country, it's the financial services sector. So you need to, in some ways or form, when you're moving around, get a sense of what's going on in the broader macroeconomic infrastructure or place in our country. So at that point, I'd like to say welcome. Welcome, Mrs. Rankin. I need to be a little bit formal.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rankin, and thanks a lot for the platform. And I've spoken to Martha and Amaze, actually. We shouldn't say Amaze, we should say Amaze. You know, it's actually
Amaze.
such a beautiful name.
Yeah.
So we actually killing the, you know, the name. And Mashatsi, welcome. And I see Lebogang has just joined. As you said, that, you know, the financial services sector, it's actually a very interesting sector. And I don't want to say that it is important like any other, but you'll see in the presentation that, you know, when you look at a sector that has almost stood firm and not necessarily was hit by COVID, but not to a huge extent like many others, it's actually the sector, you know. So I hope you enjoy a few slides that I'm going to share. And it's also some of the information is really the information that has also been taken from, you know, other experts in the industry that have shared some of their views. So I thought that it might just be interesting, you know, for me to also share the view with you guys. And the other thing is, you know, I mean, it's probably some of the things that you've come across, because it's real things. You know, when Vic asked me to talk about the COVID and how it's hit the sector, I mean, it's things that are real. So it's things that you should actually know as teachers, you know. So so in this session, I could also be educated, by the way. And I'm looking forward to the questions. Yeah. So just in terms of what Vic asked me to cover is just to look at the damage that COVID has caused in the sector, and just, you know, the pandemic, how it's affected different parts of our industry, the future of demand and skills in the sector, because, you know, as you teach students, you know, you'll find that some of the students that you're talking to, they're interested in certain sectors, and as teachers, you know, you also sort of first line defense, if I may call it that, eh? Because I mean, like nurses, we see you guys as, you know, first line people that are really, you know, helping the kids and shaping them up into their thinking. So it's important that you sort of know, you know, the skills in the sector and help them, you know, take the decisions that they want to take. And then the other aspect is just, you know, being Black a Black woman in the sector, and I'll touch on that, and just anticipated innovative changes in the sector. And where I want to actually start is firstly just that the impact of COVID, and we all know, I mean, you guys know as well, that our country, the slow growth rate has actually been there for some time. And we've seen that, and it's talks that you see on the news, that government has actually been trying to stimulate the economy. And how do they do that? I'll touch on that actually when I go into that next point, where I talk about Moody's, downgrading our bonds to junk status. So which means that, most of the foreign investors, when they look at South Africa and they want to invest in South Africa, if it's junk status, it is a bit of a risk for them. So which means that we are not attractive as a country like we used to be in the past, right? And then, so when the Reserve Bank saw how the economy was actually is positioned, low growth rate, huge issues on unemployment, what they then decided to do is, how do we help our consumers to actually start spending? Because when there's a low growth rate, it just means that people are not spending money. And the only way for them to do that, the Reserve Bank, is to decrease the interest rates. And you saw that, in fact, we've not had a low interest rate in a long time. And our interest rates now are quite low. And they actually did that to try and help us as we go and buy our bread, or we buy, the things that we like. They actually want us to start spending the money so that we can start stimulating the economy. And then we've all sort of seen in one or the other how this impact of COVID also played effect in some of the companies like Edcon. You guys know Edgars, so Edgars is part of Edcon. So Edcon closed shop, which means that all thousands of people that were working for that company, all of a sudden they actually have no jobs. Okay, and then we're starting to see consolidation in the industry. And what I mean by consolidation is you're starting to see big companies looking at smaller companies that have been affected by the economic challenges. They're starting to think of maybe we can acquire these businesses. So those are opportunities for some big companies. And then lockdown, I mentioned here that it's impacted sectors differently, and you'll see in the next slides. So for me in the asset management, so the asset management industry, basically we manage pension funds for different investors, and we invest. We one of the largest investors in the stock market. So when we look at the world, or when we look at the environment, we take into account the companies that we're buying into. And this actually brings me to the slide where...
So can I just add something there? Just if you can go back a slide, sweetie. I just wanted to just say a summary on this point here, that there's a couple of things that I think you've hit on here that are really essential. And the first one is that overall, this country's economy was heading south long before COVID came, right?
Mm-hmm.
We'd even be decreased to junk status. And the fact that even within this COVID situation, there were some companies that have done okay, and I think that's the slide you just about to go into, and some companies that didn't do okay. But I think that's also true of people. I mean, people in terms of just before COVID, some of them were going through whatever challenges they were. But even during COVID, there are some people who've thrived in COVID and some people who've been impacted through COVID. So the economy is really affected also by the individuals who are playing a role in actually making this economy tick. And that's quite interesting from this slide.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, and I think, to actually touch on what you said, I mean, if you look at where the impact has been, and if we try and make it real, I've got here severe, large, moderate impact, mild impact, right? And, I don't want to say too much about the youngsters, with the alcohol when they're having fun, but we know that, when lockdown happened, unfortunately, we couldn't actually buy alcohol. We couldn't buy cigarettes. So that was hit hard. Accommodation was hit hard because all of a sudden, also there's no travel. So people were not necessarily spending money. So you can imagine how severe those companies were hit by lockdown. Okay, and then if I maybe go to the mild one, for instance, finance and insurance companies, those were not necessarily hit as hard, and simply because, you know, we're still managing monies of different people. You know, the only you know, impact is where the individuals have suffered in terms of, you know, not receiving their incomes, which means that they might potentially be asking for what you call the, you know, payment holidays on some of the, you know, premiums that they're paying on their insurance policies. And, you know, if, for instance, with the bank, you could get a payment holiday, you know, in terms of, you know, you not paying your installment, and those things. But it doesn't mean that it's actually, the impact is there, but it's not necessarily, you know, it doesn't mean that it actually crushed the industry to the point where you know, they had to retrench. Okay.
Yeah.
Communication. I'll talk on just communication and maybe agriculture. Communication. If you think about when the COVID impact hit, so many companies had to communicate to, you know, whether from our side we communicate to our clients, whether from your side, from an educational perspective, you know, the schools were communicating to the parents, or whether, you know, you as teachers were also being communicated to by the schools, you know, but communication plays a very, very important role during this period, okay? And pharmaceuticals, you know, as you know, we all started buying vitamins, you know, even if you were not necessarily COVID positive, you started actually buying vitamin D, vitamin C, zinc, you know, so obviously pharmaceutical industries were not necessarily hit as hard. And then the next slide is really just, you know, that the first slide's being revised because of the ease of lockdown. So I won't also go into too much. But
I think these slides are interesting because they really talk to everybody beginning to understand the different sectors of an economy and
Absolutely.
the impact certain things have on those different sectors. So, you know, for those who are teachers, not everyone I think is a teacher, but some of them I think are student teachers here. But the education, you can understand that the education part that you were hit by is quite severe. And I know people I know the CEO of Penn Travel. The CEO of Penn Travel is a travel agency. I mean, they were literally obliterated, right? Flight Center and all those places. You can imagine all their businesses and people who ran Airbnbs and you know, guest houses, all obliterated. So it's very, this is a great slide for everybody to be able to see what the different sectors are and how they've all been impacted as we come out of COVID or as we progress in COVID, whichever way we're going to find ourselves.
Exactly. And if you look at education, for instance, on the first slide, education was impacted largely, right? But after the ease of lockdown, all of a sudden it moves to sort of moderate. So education is there on moderate. Why? Because you saw some other kids who started going back to creche, and students started being introduced back into the schools. And parents, you know, were now all of a sudden being forced to pay, you know, to pay for the tuitions as well, because some parents also parked paying for the monies because they just felt that, you know, but our kids are not going to school, they're online, you know, so I think to your point, Vic, exactly that it just gives you a snapshot of who was hit, and it also makes sense of why those other ones were hit more and these other ones were hit less. Okay. And I think this slide really is just, you know, I mean, I don't want to bore you with the finance stuff, but I want to just maybe, you know, just highlight the GDP, because I think that would be interesting, so that you see when on the first slide I talked about low growth, that South Africa has actually been a low growth country. 2017, our GDP was at 1.4, and 2018 it actually went down to 0.8. 2019 it's just been sliding down. Look at 2020. I mean, we are like minus 8.1. So you can imagine what challenges our president and his cabinet are facing to try and actually stimulate, you know, our country to get us to the point where, you know, we are getting to the 2%.
Yeah,
so there's a lot that needs to happen.
That's an interesting one there. And I think for everybody, you know, I'm not sure how many of you, and I'm sure most of you do understand what GDP is, which is the gross domestic product, in terms of all the activities spent in the country, how much is it growing by? And the essential thing that you need to know about this, everyone, is that it has a detrimental impact on employment. So if people are not buying and spending, then it means that that people don't have their cash strapped, whether you're a business or whether you're an individual. So it's an important figure to know. But one of the things for me that you also have to be cautious about, everybody, when you start listening to these forecasts, is the question you need to ask yourself is that if you look at 2017 to 2020, we've never grown by more than 1%. For us to go from -8 to 2% next year means we need to grow by over 10%, right?
Yeah.
So the question is, how feasible is that? But this is a very interesting slide as well.
Yeah, and that's why I make a comment here that, so we all don't know the damage that COVID has caused. We have a sense, but it's not evident.
Thanks,
yet,
Mashati.
Yeah, it's not evident yet, but we know that it's bad because we see what it's done with the unemployment. And as you see, the unemployment rate still continues to rise, but perhaps it's actually 40, perhaps it's 45, and we'll only be able to see that next year. Right. So, and to your point, Beck, this is actually quite interesting because then from an individual perspective, what you then have to do is, knowing what we know when we saw COVID hit, how is your spend? How is your savings as an individual? Because those things also come back to you as an individual, right?
No, absolutely.
And those are the things that you need to teach, the kids that you're teaching about saving. And because you're saving for the rainy day, that day that you don't know. You can imagine losing an income unexpectedly. If you didn't have some savings, put somewhere, you were obviously, you were obviously, I don't want to use the, word like stuffed, but to be quite honest, that's exactly that you find yourself in the red.
Yeah, in serious trouble.
The country's in the red, and individuals are in the red. It doesn't really help anybody, right?
And the unemployment rate there at the bottom is just, it's frightening. I mean, 39%, 38%. I mean, that's just...
Yeah. And you can imagine 39% of the 58 million that we are in the country. And that 39%, it's, imagine probably that it's mostly Black, if you think about it. It's actually our people that are unemployed. Yeah. And then just in terms of the future of demand and skills in the sector, I put this I actually got it from Google, which is actually quite nice. But just to say that it is not the strongest of the species that survives, the most intelligent that survives. It is actually the one that is most adaptable to change. And I think we all know what has happened. COVID has actually made us be quite adaptable. If you didn't adapt, you're going to have a problem, So you can imagine people like Vic and I, who are from the Stone Age, the oldies, elephants, if you're not tech savvy, you go to the youngsters in the team to, help me with Zoom, let me understand Teams, what's happening. So all of a sudden, our world is also turned upside down, because now, all of a sudden, we're moving to platforms that we're not necessarily comfortable with. But so if you don't adapt to change, unfortunately, you'll be left behind. So I mentioned these sort of 2, 4, 6 points. Leadership. From a leadership perspective, you can imagine, especially right now, how do you communicate your strategy or vision with clarity? How do you encourage others? How do you inspire them to move along with you? Right now, most companies are virtual. It's going to be even difficult to actually get people to be on the same wavelength as you as a leader. So you've got to do a lot, okay? Flexibility and adaptability, being able to work well under pressure in different time zones. So right now, it's not about, even when you're looking for a job now, I think people are now all of a sudden able to just hire people, whether you're in San Francisco or whether you're in China, because of the platform, the virtual platform now, there's no need for companies to say, I can't find a skill. So all of us, we have to be flexible, adaptable. Critical thinking, very important. It's always important. You guys know, as teachers, you teach the kids to ask questions, what's happening, who's being affected, being able to sift through information through the noise, right? Tech skills I mentioned, communication and emotional intelligence. You can't be impulsive in a class. If a student is doing something, you can't just slap them or hit them back with a comment that is not necessarily thought through. So you need to learn to be empathetic. You need to learn to be patient. You need to learn to direct, and so all those skills are required. Innovation is very critical, guys. So coming up with ideas that are sustainable. Companies are looking for innovative people. Actually, in my company, our CEO is actually encouraging different teams to come up with ideas, and he actually pays $1 million for a good idea. So you can imagine,
Wow.
how many,
I just wanted to say on that slide that for everybody who's listening, my wife and I have not communicated this slide at all, but if any of you were on the work readiness and we talked about the critical skills of the future, you'll remember flexibility, critical thinking, etc. So this slide just completely reinforces the need for these skills being skills that you think about from an individual point of view, as well as the skills that you think about how you're going to pass on to others. So I think, yeah, the critical skills of the future.
Okay. And then quick one, just in terms of women in the industry. Well, the women that are on the platform, the young women, you would know either from your mothers or from your aunts, or friends or people that you know in the different industries. Women, it's always a challenge to fight your way through the top. Okay. So see that only 30%. In fact, this is actually global. It's actually a global representation. And it's interesting, look at countries like Saudi Arabia with 4%. And you would know with Saudi Arabia, that's where they wear, the culture is Dubai, UAE, the culture is very sort of male dominated. So you can imagine for women to actually get into this position, it must be very, very difficult, right? And also if asset management, which is the industry that I'm in, women on executive committees, 24%. And then women in boards, 26%. Still very, very low numbers. So the challenge is still there. It's still slowly, it's there. In South Africa, it still scores very poorly in terms of women in management positions. So we still have a long way to go. But I think, it's for people like myself who are executives, who should actually open up opportunities for young women that are interested in joining the sector. I don't know, you guys, if you're quite familiar with people that are in the industry, but I actually had to scratch the surface to just check who is powerful in the financial services sector, who is a CEO. Black ones, I could only come up with Basani and Shirley Machaba. So Basani is the CEO of African Bank and Shirley is the CEO of PwC. There are obviously other ladies that are in different sectors. So for instance, if you look at the media and communications and tech sector, Putima Hanyele, that you guys would know, is obviously CEO of Naspers. And then of course, what's that lady's name who is the CEO of ArcelorMittal, Nyembezi Hater. So she also is a powerful woman in the mining space. So there are sort of drips and drops. You actually have to scratch the surface. Okay. So there's a quote by Maya Angelou. So you watch yourself about complaining. What you're supposed to do when you don't like a thing is change it. If you can't change it, change the way you think about it. So I think for us women is for us to change the lay of the landscape, be participative. If I see women that are younger than me that are looking for opportunities, I become deliberate in giving them the opportunities. So you guys as teachers, you help the young girls, help them build the confidence to see themselves as being able to take on opportunities if they have those opportunities given to them. And then the last one is on innovation. I mentioned earlier that we are challenged in our business to be innovative. So the banking and financial sector, it's definitely focusing on innovation because, the future is about technology. So if you don't innovate, you're going to be left behind. Key trends that we see, you know, there's digital transformation, there's fintechs that people talk about. You've heard of 4IR, you know, industrial revolution, you know, artificial intelligence, robotics. So the banking industry, I think slowly they've also been trying to make people use, you know, internet, for instance, not necessarily going inside a bank. So you see, those are the digital transform platforms that we're trying to get to, and just agile technology companies. So we know that the customers are actually evolving and lifestyle changes. So it's important for people to think innovatively. So yeah, I'm not sure if there's any questions.